In Hilchos Nedarim, the Rambam brings from the Mishnah the halacha in regards to vows that are made by a minor, by a child. And this is what the Rambam says. Katan, a child of 12 years old, or a girl of 11 years old, that they made a shavua, an oath, or a neder or a vow. We examine them, we check them, we ask if they know for whom's sake they have made the neder. In other words, we want to make sure that they understand the significance of the vow and that they're vowing it for the sake of Hashem. And if that's the case, then their vows are valid. If they don't know, then their vows and their words carry no significance whatsoever. The Rambam goes on and says that whole year, again, the boy being 12 years old or the girl being 11 years old, we need to ask them, we need to check with them again and again. That means to say that even if they made a neder in the beginning of the year, and we ask them, and they clearly understand the concept of the neder, and they know who they are making the vow for, and their vow was a valid vow. In other words, we said that yes, it is a vow. If later on during the year they make another vow, we need to check with them again, and only then is it considered a proper vow. We don't say, says the Rambam, that just because they knew in the beginning of the year and understood the seriousness and the significance of the vow, etc., we don't say we don't need to check them again, but rather throughout the whole year, anytime they would want to make a vow, we need to once again check. The Kesef Mishnah asks, he says, I don't know where the Rambam got this halacha from. Because in the Gemara says something different. The Gemara quotes the Mishnah, where the Mishnah says that we need to check them during that whole year. And the Gemara asks, why does the Mishnah need to teach us this? Why do we need to say that they need to be checked the whole year? And the Gemara explains that we would have thought that if they were already examined, if they were already checked about their understanding for 30 days, the Gemara over there says that 30 years is already counted like a year. In other words, if during the duration of 30 years in 30 days within the year, we check them. And at that point, they did not know how to make a proper neder. We may have thought that later on in the year, there's no point in checking again. That's why the Mishnah says no. Throughout the year, we do check again. The Kesef Mishnah explains that the whole point why we're checking again is because earlier on in the year, they did not know the significance of a vow. They didn't know how to make a vow properly. And later on, they're making a vow. That's when we check again. But if they initially knew about making a vow properly, there's no point in checking again. But again, what does the Rambam say? The Rambam said it the other way around. The Rambam said if they do know the significance of the vow, we still need to check them again. The Kesef Mishnah concludes that perhaps the Rambam had another version in our Gemara. Perhaps the Gemara said the other way around, that if we check them originally for 30 days, and they did know how to make a vow, then we may have thought that you don't need to check them again. That's why the Mishnah is coming and saying, no, you still need to check again. In other words, the Kesef Mishnah is saying that perhaps the Rambam had a version similar to what the Rambam says back in the Gemara. The Radvaz also explains something, the same idea. He says that it seems to be that the Girsa, the version that the Rambam had in the Gemara, is that if the child knew how to make a proper vow, that's when we still, throughout the year, need to check again. In fact, says the Radvaz, that this would seem to be a more correct version of the Gemara. That was specifically speaking about that the first time the child did know, and yet we're going to check again. Because the Radvaz explains, if in fact it's the way the version of the Gemara is the way we usually have it, the way the Kesef Mishnah quotes it, that was speaking about a child that originally did not understand the significance, and the Chiddush is that we're saying we're going to need to check again. So the Radvaz says, then we would have a very simple question on the Gemara, the way the Gemara understands the Mishnah. Just because a child did not understand the significance of the vow in the beginning of the year, Is that any reason to think that later on in the year he's not going to have a better understanding? Why would the Tana have to say that we check all year around? So it doesn't seem to make sense, says the Radvaz, that the Gemara would say, based on the Mishnah, that the Chiddush is that even though the child didn't know, yeah, we'll check again later. Obviously, we'll check again later. Whereas according to the Rambam's version, then it's actually teaching us something very, very novel. That even if they did understand in the beginning of the year, we still don't just assume later on. We don't say there's a chazaka now, that there is this a presumed idea that definitely now the child knows because he knew in the beginning of the year. The chiddush is that no, nevertheless, even later on in the year, even towards the end of the year, we still need to check again. So again, the Kesef Mishnah and the Radvaz are both suggesting that the Rambam's version of our Gemara said that we're speaking about a child that in the beginning of the year knew, and later on in the year we're checking again. But however, there's a problem with this, says the Rebbe, because when we look into the Pirush HaMishnayos of the Rambam writes clearly when he's explaining this piece of this Mishnah, this Gemara. And the Rambam explains on the Mishnah that what does the Mishnah mean that we need to check them throughout that whole year? Because we would have thought that if we already checked throughout the first 30 days and we saw clearly that they don't understand the concept of a neder, maybe there's no point in checking again later. And that's why the Mishnah says no, even if they didn't know in the beginning of the year, we still need to check again, which fits with the way we have it in our Gemara. In other words, the Rambam also had the Girs and the Gemara the way we have it, that was speaking about a child at first, in the beginning of the year, did not have the full understanding, and yet we're going to check again. So in other words, we cannot say now that the reason the Rambam is choosing, is explaining the halacha as that the child did know in the beginning of the year and we're going to check again, is because he had a different version of the Gemara, because clearly the Rambam is quoting the Gemara the same exact way, the way we have it. The Rebbe now turns to the Meiri and says that the Meiri writes the following, that when we say that we examine, we check the whole year, what this means is that even if we checked in the beginning of the year and the child did not know and did not understand, later they made another neder, we don't say, we checked already and they didn't understand, but rather we say, no, maybe by now they learned and they now do understand, and that's why we'll check again. Says the Meiri, and the same thing is true the other way around. In other words, the Meiri is learning both ways. That even if in the beginning of the year they did know, and they did understand, and we said that their vows are valid, later on in the year they make another vow, we don't just automatically say, yes, it's a good vow, but rather, once again, we need to check. In other words, the Meiri is learning that either way we have to check again. Based on this, we would be able to say that the Rambam is learning the same way, meaning that even though the Girsa in the Gemara is as we have it and as he quotes in the Pirush HaMishnayos, that we would have thought that if we checked this child for 30 days and they didn't know the significance of the Nedarim, we still, later on in the year, will check again. So even though that's the way the Gemara says it, but the Rambam holds, like the Meiri, that the actual din of needing to check again would apply even the other way around as well. Even if earlier on in the year they did know, they did understand, and we said that their vows are valid, if later on in the year they make another neder, we still don't accept that neder as a proper neder unless we're going to check again. If the Rambam believes that the din is both ways, why is the Rambam only quote one way? And which way does he quote? Not the one that the Gemara says. He quotes it only in the case that even if they knew in the beginning of the year, we check again. Says that Rebbe would be able to say that that seems to be a much greater chiddush, that's a much greater novelty than the din that even that if they didn't know, we'll check again. That seems to be more obvious. If they didn't know at the beginning of the year, yeah, well, later maybe they did find out and they did mature and now they understand. But as the Radvaz said before, that's not even a chiddush. Whereas saying that if they did understand and yet you need to check them again, that's a bigger chiddush, and perhaps that's why the Rambam says it. But the Rebbe says that seemingly this answer is not so glottic, it's not so smooth. Because, says the Rebbe, either way you look at it, there seems to be a problem. If in fact this din, that even if they knew in the beginning of the year, you check them again, if that's the bigger chiddush, then why doesn't the Gemara say that? The actual fact that the Gemara does not say the chiddush, that tells us, as the Kesef Mishnah said, as the Kesef Mishnah implied, that the Kesef Mishnah said that's implied for the Gemara, that clearly the Gemara is of the opinion that if in the beginning of the year the child did have the understanding of the vow, then there's no point in checking again because we just say there's a chazaka. He knew and understood earlier in the year, then obviously he still understands now. The Rebbe says in recent years, there was a new print of the Pirush HaMishnayos, which is a later version, a later edition, a Madura Basra of the Rambam on this Pirush HaMishnayos. In that version, it actually says, more similar to the way we have it in the Yad HaChazaka, in the halachas of the Rambam, different to the way it's in our Gemara, where the Rambam says, the other way to the way we have it in the Pirush HaMishnayos before. The Rambam says, we would have thought that if you say you have to check the whole year, we would have thought that if we found them that, yes, they are intelligent and they understand what's going on, there's no need to check again. That's why the Mishnah needs to say, no, we still need to check again. In other words, the Rambam in his final version actually learns in the Gemara, has the Girsa in the Gemara, his version of the Gemara is exactly as the Kesef Mishnah and the Radvaz were suggesting, that yes, in his Gemara, the Rambam is saying this version that we're speaking about a case that even if the child knew earlier on in the year, we still need to check again. Says the Rebbe, but the problem is we need to understand. Clearly the Rambam has both of these versions. From the actual fact that in the first edition of the Pirush HaMishnayos, the Rambam went for the Girsa that the Gemara says that we're speaking about a case where the child did not have the understanding earlier on in the year, and therefore we need to ask again, check again later. And in fact, that's the version or the edition of the Rambam, the one that became nisparsing, publicized for all the Yidden throughout all the generations. This is the main version that was around. And the Rambam clearly has that version. So that tells us that according to the Rambam, there is room. In other words, it does make sense, that version as well. And what would be the point then of, what would be the idea of saying, oh, if she didn't know in the beginning of the year, why should we maybe not ask again later on in the year? What would even be the svara for that, as we asked before? So the Rebbe says we'll have to find, well, obviously, he's going to take one of the various different tirutzim that the Mefarshim give of why we would have even thought that if you checked in the beginning of the year and they didn't know, what's the point? Why wouldn't we think of not checking again? So, but the bottom line is the Rambam clearly had these two versions, and first he accepted that version, that we're speaking about first a case that the child did not know, and yes, we will check again later in the year. So the Rebbe now wants to understand, why did the Rambam sort of go back and regret that way of learning, and rather is accepting the second version, which is not the common version of the Gemara, that we're speaking about a case that even if the child knows how to make a proper vow, yet we still need to check the child again later on in the year as well. The Rebbe says the question, the wonder is even bigger. According to the Girsa of the Rambam in this second and this later edition of the Pirush HaMishnayos, that we're speaking about a case that the child did understand earlier on in the year and was still going to ask later again and again. That's the way he paskins in the Rambam as well. The Rebbe says, according to this, comes out this most amazing chiddush, that even though throughout Torah we always do rely on a chazaka, in other words, once something was established, we continue to assume that that's the way it is, yet we're saying that by Nadarim it's completely different. That even though we checked this child already, and we know clearly that he has the chazaka, that yes, he understands what a neder is all about, etc., and yet we need to go and check again. Maybe it changed. We don't have such an example anywhere else. Even more than this, says the Rebbe, from the wording of the Rambam, that we say we need to check them again, and only then is it a proper nether, it seems to be implying that until we check again, The neder is completely nothing. It's not even a neder misofik. In other words, maybe on a doubt we should consider it as a neder. In fact, says the Rebbe in the Tur, it says this very explicitly. Einoi neder. It's totally not a neder until they'll be examined and checked again. Even though he has this chazaka, we established already that he's a child that knows how to and understands the proper significance of a neder. So surely we need to find a very, very powerful or strong reason why the Rambam would have changed from his original edition in the Pirush HaMishnayos, which again was the one that says that if the child didn't know earlier on, we'll check again later in the year, maybe by now he knows. Why is he taking the not common version of the Gemara and saying this amazing chidush that we're totally not going to rely on the chazak, on the fact that this is a child that knew earlier on? We're not even going to take it as a doubt. Maybe he still knows, but rather until he's checked, we're completely not considering his neder as a neder. Says the Rebbe, we're going to understand all of this by first looking at another difference between these two editions of the Pirush HaMishnayos. And this is in regard to what's called Oinas Nedorim. Oinas Nedorim literally means the period, the time of when someone could start making Nedorim. In other words, there's a din by Nedorim that one does not need to be a gadol, an adult, rather even a minor, and we'll soon see what a minor means, but even someone that's younger than a gadol, than an established adulthood, his neder is a neder. We call it mufla samuch leish. In other words, mufla is from the word in the Torah ki yafli, one who verbalizes the vow, makes the vow. Samuch leish, close to adulthood. So when is this oinas nedarim? What are we talking about? Now, again, in the common version of Pirush HaMishnayos, in the original edition, there it says that we're speaking about the year before Bar and Bas Mitzvah. When the girl is 11 or the boy is 12, throughout that year, we check them. And if we see that they know what a neder is all about, then their neder is a proper neder, even though they are minors. The Rambam says, Vizuhi, and that's called Oinas Nedarim, which is hinted to in many places. In other words, Oinas Nedarim, the special time frame for Nedarim, starts the year before proper adulthood. Again, by a girl when she's 11, and by a boy when he's 12. And we check in regards to their Nedarim. Again, we have to be knowing that they understand what a proper neder is, and l'shemi nodru, for whom they are making the neder. In other words, it's a neder to Hashem. And this is also the shita of Rashi and other Rishonim. But then we look at the Ma'adura Basra at the second edition of the Pirush HaMishnayos, and there the Rambam changes. And there he says, once a girl is 12, once a boy is 13, then there's no need to ask them anymore, to check anymore whether they understand the full significance. Automatically, their nedarim are absolute valid nedarim, even though they are minors, because we're soon going to see, we're speaking about a situation that it's possible that they didn't develop the signs of maturity yet. And the Rambam says, V'zuhi oinas nedarim, and that's what we call oinas nedarim. In other words, oinas nedarim, the period for nedarim, the time for nedarim starts by a girl when she is 12, by a boy when he's 13, and this is even if they did not develop yet the pubic hairs. In other words, there's just by the actual fact that they reach that age, regardless of the signs of maturity, we also don't need to ask them and examine and with any questions, because their nedarim are going to be valid vows, even if they say clearly, Ein anu yoidin, we don't really understand, what was the point of the neder, who we made a vow for, etc. And the Rebbe says this is also the shita of the Bahag. The Rebbe says in the Rambam and the Sefer Hayad, he actually paskins the same way. That a boy of 13 years old, a girl of 12 years old, even if they say we don't know for whom's sake we made the neder is still a valid neder. Their words carry weight and significance. And even if they did not develop the signs of maturity, and the Rambam concludes, V'zuhi oinas nedarim, and this is oinas nedarim that's discussed all over the place. What about the concept of a child even before the year of Bar and Bas Mitzvah? The boy of 12 and the girl 11. which we said that if they understand what the neder is all about, then their nedarim are valid. So the Rebbe says that's a separate din. This is not part of what we call oinas nedarim, according to the Rambam and Sefer Hayad and the second edition of the Pirush HaMishnayos. Rather, this is a separate concept, which we'll discuss later in the Sicha as well. So again, we have two differences now between the two editions in the Rambam. The first difference is going to be that in the first edition, we're speaking about a child, if they didn't know earlier on in the year and didn't understand, we're going to examine them and ask them later again and check with them again when they make another neder. Whereas in the second edition, we're speaking about a situation where they did know in the beginning of the year and later we still need to examine again. The second difference is, again, in the first edition, we say Oinas Nedarim is the year before Bar and Bas Mitzvah. According to the second edition, Oinas Nedarim is when they turn Bar and Bas Mitzvah, but we don't have to check anything with them. They're automatically within the category of Nedarim. Says the Rebbe that these two differences are actually dependent on each other. How do we understand this? Says the Rebbe, the point of the explanation is like this. According to the Shita of the Rambam, when we speak about a katan, when we speak about this child, there is no geder, there is no concept of chazakah at all, as far as saying that just because he knew something or understood something in a particular way, and he had a mindset in a particular way earlier on, automatically that carries on. Because the translation of the word chazakah means when something is very, very firm and strong, it's certainly going to change this way, so we always assume that that's the way it is. But by a child, he doesn't have this strength, this permanent idea within his seichel, because he doesn't have what's called true da'as. One of the ideas of a bar das, we say a child when he turns bar bas mitzvah is a bar das. What we mean is that he makes a rational, logical decision, but in a way that it's permanent, it stays, it's firm. It doesn't sway. The Rebbe says we see clearly by a child who is constantly changing. Doesn't make a firm hachlota, absolute firm decision. It's very easy to make him change his mind and make him change his hachlota, his decisions. The Rebbe says this is also very much connected to the whole idea of why they're responsible only when they're 12 or 13 years old, a girl or a boy. The Rebbe says it's known the reason why a child under Bar Bas Mitzvah, even if he's very, very smart, and even if he's very knowledgeable, and he knows all the dinim of the mitzvahs asay and the mitzvahs loises in the best way, is still not going to be punished if they're over on a mitzvah. It's again because they're lacking this firm das. So now going back, says the Rebbe, this is why the Rambam paskins that even if they were checked earlier on in the year, we don't just automatically assume later in the year that yes, definitely now they also know the significance of the neder, the seriousness of it, that they're doing it for Hashem, etc. Rather, we need to check them again and again. The Rebbe says, the Rambam is saying this because this is a simple svara, this is a simple logic. There's no machloikus about that even, that you can't establish a chazakah with this child. If that's the case, so what is the difference between the two different versions in the Gemara about what we're checking later? Is it a case where the child did not know earlier on, and we check again to see maybe now they do know? Or the case, or the version, which the Rambam seems to accept, that they did know earlier on and is still going to check later? Says the Rebbe, the Girsa in the Gemara, the way we have it in the Gemara, which the Gemara said that we would have thought that if we checked the child already, and they did not know about Nedarim, the significance of the Nedarim, then maybe there's no need to check again later. What does that mean? And why is that? The Rebbe says that's going to be according to the opinion that Oinas Nedarim, the time when a neder starts with all of its significance, is referring to a girl that's 11 years old and a boy that's 12 years old, and they know who they're making the neder for, because according to this shita, it will be a greater chidush to say this din, that even if they didn't know earlier on, we're still going to check them again. That will be a greater chidush than the din that the Rambam brings, that you check them the whole year if they did know earlier on, as we'll soon see why that is. Whereas according to the opinion that Oinas Nedarim, the real proper setting of the time of a neder fully, is only after the girl turned 12 and the boy is 13, as the Rambam's conclusion is, according to this opinion, as there's no room even, it doesn't even make sense to think that if you check them and they didn't know the significance earlier on in the year, there's no svara to say that you shouldn't have to check them again. Obviously you'll check them again. And therefore the Rambam has to accept this uncommon girsa, uncommon version, that no, we're speaking about a case that even if they were checked earlier on, and they knew, you're still going to check again. The Rebbe is going to explain all of this soon, why these things are dependent on each other. But in order to explain this, the Rebbe first introduces another point. The Rebbe says this whole idea generally, that a child could make a neder in the year before bar and bas mitzvah. If they understand the significance of the neder, they know for whom they made the neder, etc. This itself can be learned in two ways. One way is that the chiddush is about the age. In other words, while most mitzvahs the age is 12 or 13, bas or bar mitzvah, by nedarim you don't need to wait for this age of maturity. In other words, you don't need to wait for the boy to be 13 years old. But rather, the din over here is that even at the age of 12, he can make a neder, or the girl at 11. So it's about the age. What is this whole business about that we need to also examine them to know their das, to know whether they understand who they're making the neder for? The Rebbe says that's more almost like a technical thing. We also need to remove any obstacles, so to speak. In other words, since bottom line is if they wouldn't know, then their nedarim wouldn't be counted. And after all, he is a minor, so we need to make sure that he also understands what he's doing. But the main point is the age. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is, no. The main chiddush is about the das, about this knowledge or mindset that the child has, which is, for other mitzvahs, for all other things, you need a greater level of das, which starts the obligation of bar mitzvah. By nedarim, for vows, it's sufficient a smaller level of das to make a neder. So why are we speaking about an age, 11 or 12? That's only sort of like a sign. In other words, this is the age where it's possible that a child will finally have this level of das, whereas before that, even this level of das doesn't exist. So again, there's two ways. Are we focused about that it's a certain age that came, or is it that a certain level of das came? Says the Rebbe now will go back to these two different opinions about Oinas Nedarim, which again, Oinas Nedarim, for the time being, would translate in the time that the full age of neder applies. All the ideas of a neder apply fully. So these two ways of looking, the way we just described, of saying, is it an age thing or is it a das thing? Both of these ways only apply and only make sense that we could, in other words, that we could even consider both ways. That's only if we're speaking about Oinas Nedarim being the age of 11 for a girl and 12 for a boy. And that is exactly the chiddush that the Torah is coming to tell us, mufla samach leish, that even before adulthood, there's already this time where a child could fully make a neder. And that's why we could view it in two ways, these two ways that we discussed. When you say mufla samach leish, where is the main chiddush? Is it the idea of mufla, in other words, the idea that he knows how to make a neder? Or is the focus on samach leish? In other words, he's close to becoming a 13-year-old or she a 12-year-old, so it's about the age. Whereas, according to the opinion that Oinas Nedarim is referring to a 13-year-old boy or a 12-year-old girl, but maybe that didn't fully develop at the mature signs yet, the Rebbe says, according to this, it makes sense to say that the whole idea of making a neder before they turn bar or bas mitzvah is not about the age, then it's only going to be about the concept of das. We're only focusing on the idea of, if they could say, we know, we understand for whom we made the neder. Why is that? Because that would be the major difference between these two stages, before bar mitzvah and after bar mitzvah. In other words, once the child turned bar and bas mitzvah, even if they didn't develop the mature signs yet, that's going to be more about the age. And then there's the year before, where it's more about the das. In other words, the chiddush that the Torah gives about according to this way of looking at it, about a 13-year-old boy or a 12-year-old girl, even if they don't have the signs of maturity yet, the whole chiddush is about the point that, they reached a certain age. The age of Oinas Nedarim, the time of Nedarim, is 13 for a boy, 12 for a girl. And in fact, it has nothing to do with das. It's only about the age. As the Rambam paskins, we quoted this before, that even if they said clearly, Ein on a yodim, we don't really understand, nevertheless, it's a proper vow. Then there's the second chiddush, which is even the year before Bar and Bas Mitzvah, 11 for a girl and 12 for a boy. Here, it's not about the main point of it is not about the age, but it's about the idea that we say, they understand already the significance of a neder, the das, and therefore we consider it as a neder. So again, just in summary, just this last point. If we speak about Oinas Nedarim, the whole idea of Oinas Nedarim starts at 11 or 12, 11 for a girl and 12 for a boy, then there's two ways of looking at it. Is it more about the fact that they reached a certain age, or is it about that they've reached a certain level of das? But if we say that the whole Oinas Nedarim really is mainly once a child is bar and bas mitzvah, so then when we look at the year before bar and bas mitzvah, although technically they could make a vow, but it's clearly then to do with their das, not about the age. Age thing is mainly by bar and bas mitzvah. We say no matter what they understand or they don't understand, the neder is going to be a neder. But before that, we need to look at the das. The Rebbe says this is certainly so according to the way the Ragachover explains, that according to the Rambam, this concept of mufla samach leish, that making a vow close to the time of adulthood, midoiraisa, is only by a 13-year-old boy and a 12-year-old girl, even though they didn't develop the signs of maturity. And that's really the way it seems to be implied from the simple wording of the Rambam. Once they reach the age of adulthood, their nedarim are 100% proper nedarim, even though they didn't bring the signs of maturity. And the Rambam says, "V'dover zeh," that is minat Torah, that hamufla samuch lish, the one who makes the vow close to the times of adulthood. So the hekdesh they make, anything they donate to the Beis Hamikdash is considered valid. Any neder they make is valid. Whereas this din of the year before Bar and Bas Mitzvah, according to the Rambam, that would be, everyone would agree, only midrabanan. So if that's the case, says the Rebbe, then surely it makes sense to say that the takanas chachamim that they said, if it's midrabanan, then this takanas chachamim that they're saying that it's the year before Bar and Bas Mitzvah, is to do not just because they turned a certain age, but it's mainly to do with the fact of das, that they understand for who they made them in neder, and that's why the chachamim said that their neder will be a proper neder. Says the Rebbe, based on all of this, we can now go back and understand the two different versions in the Gemara. Which again, we're speaking about, did the Gemara say that if the child does not know the significance of the neder and who he made the neder for, that's what we need to check again later, which is the common version of the Gemara? Or the version of the Gemara that was saying that even if the child did know, which is what the Rambam accepts in his Yad HaChazaka, even if the child didn't know, you have to examine again. The Rebbe explains, according to the opinion that Oinas Nedarim, that the full idea of a neder fully applies when the girl is 11 and the boy is 12, we could then understand why the Gemara, as we have it in our Gemara, would have thought, would have suggested that even if we asked them earlier on in the year and they did not know, maybe we shouldn't ask them again. That was this, the Gemara said, the Mishnah has to say we have to check again, because we would have thought that maybe you don't have to check again. Why would you think you don't have to check again, as we asked earlier in the Sicha? Because since one of the two possibilities we said was about the age, not about the das, it's possible that the whole concept of mufla samach lish, of making a vow close to the time of adulthood, is mainly going by age. In other words, the Torah revealed that a girl at 11 could already make a neder. So if that's the case, we checked with this girl earlier on in the year, and we clearly saw that she doesn't really understand the full significance of the neder and who she's making the vow for, etc. Well, clearly this proves that for this particular girl, she didn't reach this stage this stage of maturity to be able to make a neder. And therefore, Oinas Nedarim for this girl clearly didn't apply when she turned 11. So we're going to say, okay, so we need to wait for her bas mitzvah. That's what the Gemara is saying we would have thought. That's why the Mishnah needs to come and tell us that the main chiddush of that's why the Mishnah needs to come and tell us that no, even though you would have thought there's no point even in checking again later. So we're saying no, that the point was not about the age, that it was more about the das. It was more about the understanding of the child. And therefore, if it's about the understanding of the child, that they reached a certain level of understanding by 11 or 12 for a girl or a boy. So therefore, in other words, it's not just purely age. So therefore, if they do, that's what the Mishnah is telling us now. So if they do reach later on this das, their neder is a neder. And therefore we should check again later. Even if earlier on in the year they didn't know. Because it's possible that in the das they did grow. The Rebbe says, this kosal kadaitach, this way of saying that we would have thought that maybe there's no point in checking again because clearly they didn't reach this level of adulthood, says the Rebbe there's much more room to actually entertain this thought than entertaining the thought that just because they knew in the beginning of the year, we shouldn't have to check them again. Why? Because we said already before that it seems to be quite obvious that there's no chazaka by a child, and therefore, obviously, if we checked them earlier on in the year, and they knew, we're still going to check them again because their minds fluctuate. And therefore, again, according to this version in the Gemara first entertained the thought that maybe we should say that even if earlier on in the year the child didn't know, maybe there's no point in checking again later because clearly they didn't reach this level of adulthood. And that's what we're saying. No, it's about the das, and therefore we are going to check again. But according to the maskana of the Rambam, but according to the final ruling of the Rambam, in his Yad HaChazak in his second edition of Pirush HaMishnah is that the whole idea of the child being able to make a vow the year prior to Bar Bas Mitzvah is because the concept of das, as we said before. So now it's the other way around. There's no reason to even think that just because a child didn't know earlier on in the year, they won't understand and know later in the year. If the whole point is das, obviously a child earlier in the year won't have a certain level of das, and later in the year they can mature, and obviously they'll know more. That's what happens naturally. And therefore the Rambam needs to look at the other girsa and say, no, even if a child knew in the beginning of the year, we still need to check again. Why does the Gemara need to say this? Because this itself is what the chidush of our Mishnah is, the way the Gemara sees it, that even though we asked the child in the beginning of the year and they did have das, they did understand. Nevertheless, we need to tell you, but it's not a proper full das. In other words, you don't have the chazak on it, and therefore you still gonna need to go and check again. So what this all hinges on basically is how we understand when oinas nedarim, when the full stage of nedarim starts. We're saying it's because the Rambam doesn't want to say that oinas nedarim starts fully the year before in Bar Bas Mitzvah. The real oinas nedarim is only after Bar Bas Mitzvah. That's why he chooses the version of we're speaking about even if a child knows earlier on, we need to ask them again. So now the Rebbe wants to understand why. Why is the Rambam learning this in oinas nedarim? The Rebbe says we can explain the reason of the Rambam according to the way that Tzafnas Paneach explains it, to say, according to the opinion that oinas nedarim is specifically when they are bar and bas mitzvah, it's the only things they don't have the signs of maturity yet, but they are already bar and bas mitzvah, not the year before. Why is that? Says the Rebbe, because in the whole concept of nedarim, there's an amazing chiddush. And that is that a yid has the ability to take something that was 100% permissible till now, according to Torah. And the way a neder works is he's saying that he's making this forbidden to himself like a carbon. And right now, this object that he made like a carbon got the kedusha similar, to a certain extent, like the kedusha of a carbon. The Rebbe says this has an amazing chiddush even compared to carbonis themselves. because karbanos have various different limitations. Only certain animals, only certain things from the plant world or the inanimate world could be brought on the Mizbeach. And yet by Nedarim, you don't have these limitations. As long as you say this item is going to be like something else that a person could make into a carbon or could make a neder about. So when he says this item, even if it's a thing that's tameh, and he says this is going to be like a carbon or something like that, then through his neder, he's bringing now a kedusha onto this item that he made the neder. Says the Rebbe, so we have over here sort of a paradox that specifically by nedarim, where you need this extra special great koyach, even more than through other mitzvahs, to bring down a kedusha even to an ordinary object. And yet the Torah says that even a katan, even a minor, who's not shayach yet to other mitzvahs, is able to bring about this kedusha if he's in this stage of mufla samach leish. So now the question becomes, when does this age start? Says the Rebbe, therefore the Rambam, according to the Tzachmas Paneach, says it's enough to say the chiddush regarding a minor, in other words, a 13-year-old or 12-year-old girl that reached the age of adulthood but just is lacking the physical signs of maturity. So you can say, fine, such a child could do it. But not to say even a greater chiddush, that even a child, a girl of 11 or a boy of 12, as long as they already know how to make the neder, they should be able to achieve such an amazing kedusha without limitations. So the Rambam is hesitant to be able to include this child in this stage of oinas nedarim. Nevertheless, says the Rebbe, the opinion of a number of Rishonim, and according to some Acharonim, even the Rambam holds, that mufla samach leish, we say that the neder is a neder min ha-Torah, does include, or at least also include, the child before Bar Bas Mitzvah that understands what a neder is all about. So now the Rebbe wants to explain this way of looking at it. Says the Rebbe will understand it based on what the Tzemach Tzedek explains when discussing the reason for that by nedarim we don't have the limitations that we usually have by karbonos, is because when a carbon becomes holy, it's becoming holy according to the gzeira of the Torah, Hashem's chachma. In other words, the Torah says you could take this animal and you make it into this carbon, etc. Whereas by nedarim, a kedusha is coming down from a level that is even higher than chachma. And that's actually hinted in the words when we speak about nedarim. It says ish, etc. Ki yafli lahadir, ki yafli linder. Yafli is from the word of that we're speaking about. This is the word that we use for making a neder, that he verbalizes the neder. But yafli is also from the word pella, like a wonder. In other words, nedarim comes from the level which is called yafli, from the word pella, a wonder, which is higher than chachma. The chachma of Torah is higher than seichel. So the ability to koyach, to be able to reach this level, which is even, so to speak, higher than the chachma of Torah, how do the Yidden have that? Because Yidden, it says, as kadmu l'Torah, they proceed, they come even before Torah. The connection between a Yid and Hashem is deeper, is higher than Torah. That's why we say Yisrael, afal pishakati Yisrael, a Yid, even if he sinned, he's still a Yisrael. Even if a Yid is not keeping Torah Rachmana litzlan, it doesn't become that he's not a Yid chas v'shalom. And this is expressed in the idea of nedarim, where the words of the person himself is accomplishing this kedusha according to the desire of the person without these limitations that karbonos have. Now, nevertheless, nedarim is still a mitzvah in the Torah, because all inyanim of avodas Hashem are revealed through the Torah. The Rebbe gives an example like by tshuva. On the one hand, we say tshuva is higher than Torah, like the Razal say. The Torah was asked, if a person sinned, what should be his punishment? And the Torah responded, he should bring a carbon asham. Then the Medrash says, they asked Hashem, what should happen to a sinner to be forgiven? Hashem says he should do tshuva and be forgiven. In other words, tshuva, on the one hand, is not coming from Torah by itself, it's coming from Hashem himself. And that's why tshuva actually has the ability to fill any lacking that a person had in fulfilling Torah. But nevertheless, who's the one that tells us that tshuva is higher than Torah? It's Torah is the one that reveals that we have the ability to do tshuva, and tshuva becomes a mitzvah in the Torah. So similarly over here in this idea of nedarim, Torah itself is the one that tells us about a neder. So this is the explanation for the fact that the koyach for the idea of nedarim, a yid has even before he becomes obligated in the other mitzvahs of the Torah, because nedarim are connected to the mitzvahs, to the very existence of the yid, the way he's even higher than Torah or precedes Torah. And that's the whole chiddush of this child. It's mufla samuch leish, that he knows how to make this neder, which is called lahafli, from this word pella. In other words, it's not so much negay, this whole mila of the das. Doesn't have to have the das in the most perfect way, which is going to be perfect only when he's a gadol, only when he's an adult, but rather he has this idea of lahaflis. That means he has this level of pella of the neshama, which is higher than chachma, which comes in a revealed way. Even before this time of Bar Bas Mitzvah, this is when this level is coming, ba'ofen golui, in a revealed way.